We got one more guest, one more segment here for this Wednesday edition of Bang the Book Radio. We're going to change things up here a little bit. Bring on professional handicapper Kyle Hunter from HunterSportsPicks.com. Kyle, how's it going today, man?
Going all right, man. A little bit of a difficult week here with a lot of things going on and a little bit under the weather here myself. But, I'm glad that we were able to do a segment here this week still.
Yeah, and obviously for those that listen to us all the time, unable to do the segment on Monday with Kyle, told you we'd get him on the show here later in the week. We're doing that here on Wednesday, so it's going to have all of us screwed up for the rest of the week, not knowing what day it is. But we want to make sure we got something on the show here for you. And in fact, with Kyle having a little bit of a cough, hopefully you'll make it through this segment. But we're probably going to shorten things up a little bit. Hopefully next Monday we'll be able to go a little bit longer talking college football and college basketball. But we'll start on the college basketball side here first, mostly because I have all those tabs open already. Interesting start to the season, to say the least, now that we're a little over a week into the year.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing was, how are the new rules going to affect the game? So far, it's been great for underbettors. 163 unders and 118 overs, 58.01% unders. This has slowed down a little bit here the last few days. I believe it started something like 66 and 30 to the under. So, obviously the odds makers are going to adjust and the betting market's going to adjust. So that's something to keep in mind right now, is that if you like the under, you probably want to play it soon. If you like the over, in a lot of cases, you probably want to wait and play that later, because that's really getting a lot of run right now. People are talking about the under quite a bit based on the new rules. The other thing that kind of stands out to me when you look at what's happened so far, home teams are 54.5% ATS. I don't think that's likely to continue. I would have to go back and look and see if it's been the case that home teams have done well in the non-conference games or not. I do think, though, that in general still, home field advantage, home court advantage, probably still overrated. So I think there could be some value on road teams coming up.
Now, I guess when we talk about the under doing well here early on in the season, I mean, is this, the exception, not the norm? Is it usually overs early in the year because you've got, the officiating mandates, and you also have teams? You've talked about this before in our previous segments. Every head coach in the country, at least not everyone, but most of them say, we want to play faster this year. So right. Do you usually see the over coming through at this time of the year?
Neutral site games have been really good to unders early in the year. The games that are at regular home sites have done well to the over in past years. I will say that a lot has to do with what the rule changes are and whether they're calling more fouls, or if, there's been a big rule change that the odds makers don't know how to adjust to. I will say that I've noticed in quite a few of these games here so far this year, there have been less fouls called on average. So it's something to kind of keep in mind and look at as we go forward. We'll see how many of obviously there's still going to be some ref shows. There's going to be games that there's tons of fouls, but, on the average, is there going to be a little bit less of the ticky-tack fouls? If so, then, you need to adjust as far as betting those totals. But I think that the biggest key is obviously the 3-point range, 3-point number being really bad. There's been some teams really shooting poorly. And I'll just say that I had a game like Alabama, Florida Atlantic over on Monday. And that game, moves up a bunch, tons of closing line value. And I don't remember exactly what Florida Atlantic finished shooting threes, but it was, 5 for 30 or something like that. You kind of wonder after a while, why wouldn't they start shooting some twos? But, we've had a lot of games like that where 3-point shooting numbers have been worse. I still think that that's not all because of the line moving back. I mean, it's not such a big move back that nobody can make a shot from back there. So I would say I think that the rules have been good for the under. I also think the officiating has changed a little bit. Maybe they haven't had quite as many things that they wanted to enforce as past years. And then I would say that also don't overreact to this, though, because it's not like you can just bet unders all in every single game the rest of the year and you're going to do great. But I mean, that's going to be a ton of volume to start with, and everybody's going to hear this. Everybody's going to talk about it. And eventually there's going to be some value the other way in some games. I will say something we've talked about quite a bit in the past. These neutral site unders do far better than the regular games. So we'll have a lot of neutral site games here coming up, and I think we're going to talk about a couple of them.
Here is something I do want to ask you about. There are two elements. You mentioned home court advantage and maybe it being a little bit overrated here still, especially early on in the year. I want to ask you first about long travel, and then I'm going to ask you second about altitude and the adjustments that you make with that. But, we've seen, obviously, there are some strange games here in the non-conference. On Wednesday alone, Niagara goes from Buffalo, New York to Nacogdoches, Texas to play Stephen F. Austin. You've got Eastern Washington making a nice long hike out to St. Louis. Cal State Bakersfield taking on Northern Iowa. So you've got some teams that make some really, really long road trips. And look, we saw Winthrop beat St. Mary's in a back-to-back on Monday night. We saw San Jose State go to Hofstra up in the New York City area, win that game, then come back and lose to Portland. I believe that was at home or either in Portland, one of the two. It's not like these long travel spots are automatic play on or play against situations, but how do you factor that into the numbers you create from a home court advantage standpoint?
Well, there's no correct answer for exactly what the change should be. I will say that I think the important distinction here is that if you're going someplace that you're not even close to used to going, if this is someplace that is just totally foreign to you, then the adjustment has to be a little bit more. I would say that if you've got a team who is going a long ways away from home, they're not used to that, especially if they're a young team. I would bump up the home court advantage by a couple points. I think that moving it in an extreme way is just too much. I know some people would probably say, well, just add 4 or 5 points of home court advantage. Like I said, I think home court advantage is a little bit overvalued. It hasn't shown itself so far this year, but I think it will in the long term. It has been in the past few years in general. But I think that, one other thing that stands to point out to me is you talk about a team that makes a really long road trip like San Jose State. They go on the road, beat Hofstra, and then they come home and lose to Portland. Portland's not a good team. Neither are San Jose State, obviously, but big upset there of Hofstra. Hofstra lost a lot of players from last year's team, so not quite as big of a stunner as some might think. But to me, it creates a bad spot in that next game because, most people would think, well, they're back at home, everything's fine. They still had a long travel to go. When you come back home, everybody thinks everything's fine. I think your home court advantage in that next game when you come back home should be a little bit less than it normally would be.
No, that's an excellent point. I completely agree with that statement. And, we'll see what happens to Winthrop, for example, just using them. They play at East Tennessee State, I think, Thursday night before they actually go back home and play their first game there in Rock Hill, South Carolina. So, again, keep an eye out for those two because you have some teams that, and we'll talk about one in a little bit in Washington, won't play a true road game until conference play. Some teams won't play more than maybe 1 or 2 home games here in the non-conference. So we'll try to hit on those as we go along here. But the other one I wanted to ask you about is teams that play in altitude that aren't used to it. You've got an Omaha team playing Colorado State on Wednesday night, but they play every year in Denver because the Pioneers in their conference. So it's not as big of a deal for Omaha to go and play in Fort Collins, Colorado, as it is, say, the Green Bay Phoenix to go and play in Albuquerque against New Mexico, or you got a situation where you've got a team making a long trip to Wyoming here in Cal State Fullerton to go play in Laramie. That's already going to be built into the line, though, when you get those really extreme altitude situations.
Yeah, that's usually going to be built into the line. And like you said, you have to separate these from have they done something similar or have they not? If a team's already been going to Colorado or Utah or Wyoming and they're just playing a different team, it doesn't really matter. I mean, they've been used to this, especially if they're veterans. I would say the young teams going to play their first game in altitude, that's where I would look to bump the home court advantage up even a little bit more for the other team based on the fact that maybe they're totally new to this. Maybe they almost have nobody who's done this before. But most of these teams are going to be fairly used to it. Like you said, Nebraska, Omaha would be used to doing something like that. On the other hand, Green Bay would not be accustomed to playing in altitude. That would be a spot I'd be concerned to play a team like Green Bay. They play extremely fast. We're playing in altitude, something they're not used to playing in. I would look to either go the other way or just stay away from that game.
Well, and it's funny, too. You look, for example, Oregon State plays Wyoming here coming up this weekend. Oregon State, on one hand, used to playing in altitude, going to Boulder and Salt Lake City every year. On the other hand, Wyoming and Laramie is even higher in elevation than Salt Lake City and Boulder. So it's still a little bit different. Maybe that one's not as factored into the number because of what I just said. Oh, Oregon State's used to it. They do it every year. Yeah, but not to that degree. So these altitude situations, interesting. The weird travel spots, interesting. And again, if you think something is already built into the line, guess what? You've got live betting. You've got second half betting. You've got opportunities with adjusted numbers that aren't going to have that built-in inflation to the home court advantage. So a lot of different ways to go about it here early in the college basketball season.
Yeah, and remember, too, that, if a team plays a game at altitude, the next game they might not play the best either, especially if they're playing a difficult opponent, playing a fast tempo or something like that. That could affect the next game also. And I'm just kind of sitting here looking at Wyoming's schedule as we were talking. They're basically not leaving Wyoming, and they went to South Carolina. And now they're just going to be in Wyoming until January 1st. So that seems pretty interesting. I guess they have one neutral site game against Colorado at Las Vegas, but quite the interesting schedule there for the Wyoming Cowboys. So you're going to be talking about a lot of teams here, Detroit, Louisiana, teams who are not used to going and playing at altitude that are about to go to Wyoming.
Yeah, and of course then too, you look at what Wyoming did against South Carolina, and it was not a good effort, closer to sea level. So as they get some more games under their belt, they're playing everything at altitude. All of a sudden, you go play at sea level against somebody, or something close to it. Game like San Diego State on January 21st. Their road games are Denver, Boise, Colorado State, and Nevada before that. 3 of those 4 at pretty decent elevation. San Diego State, not so much. So look for Wyoming. Again, I mean, this is way far in advance, obviously, but these things do matter, and some of these travel and scheduling situations will add up as the season goes along. Couple of games on the.
Can I add one more thing about Wyoming? I think Wyoming's going to be a really bad team this year. I would look to go against Wyoming if I was going to bet on or against them. They're a team I'd rather fade. So I wanted to say that because I don't think that they're going to be a great look in some of these spots in these home games just because they lost a lot from last year. This is a team that is trying to slow down their tempo in a big way this year compared to a year ago. A couple of years ago, this team was 8th fastest in the country in possession length, and now that they're going to be one of the 5 or 10 slowest teams in the country. So don't lay many points with Wyoming, and don't be afraid to go against them if you think the spot is right.
I don't understand why you wouldn't play at a fast pace in altitude. I just, it's crazy to me. But, again, and also, too, I mean, keep in mind that, we talk about these elevation, these scheduling spots, but they may not be equalizers, which is exactly what you just said, because Wyoming's talent level way down. They're changing their style of play. It doesn't necessarily mean you want to fade the team making the long trip or the long travel. Means they may be able to keep it a little bit closer. But again, if you've got a significant mismatch, still something that you want to factor into the equation. All right, a couple of games we want to touch on here specifically in college basketball. One of them here on Wednesday night. Interesting game in Milwaukee between Purdue and Marquette. We talked on Tuesday's show about LSU and VCU, also Villanova and Ohio State with Ralph Michaels. Here we talk about Purdue and Marquette, which, I mean, hey, this one's right up there with those other 2 games in terms of intrigue and, the possibility for being very, very good.
Yeah, good game here. Purdue coming off that loss to Texas this past weekend. That was a good game there, 70-66. Pretty defensive-minded game, a slower pace. Purdue has played very slow so far this year. I've been a little bit surprised. I'm keeping track of the tempo changes really closely, and Purdue has been one of the biggest tempo changes to move down so far this year. They slowed the game down as much as they could against Green Bay, which surprised me a bit. And then they played very slow against Texas as well. So that creates one of those tempo wars that we like to talk about here against Marquette. Marquette's going to want to play fast. 76 possessions in their first game against Loyola. Who wins the tempo war here? Marquette, my question mark for them is turnovers. I don't know that they have good enough enough people around Howard at this point. Howard's obviously a really good player. There's no doubting that. And he took 55% of their shots in their first game. Who who else is going to step up for them at this point? They had some people transfer away. Marquette, to me, doesn't have the depth that a team like Purdue has. Purdue, I think, will slow this game down. They're pretty good on offense, pretty good on defense as well. Obviously, if Howard shoots lights out, they can beat anybody. And, they shot 61% from three-point range in their first game. If they do something like that again, they're going to win this game. But I would say my lean here would be to Purdue. I think that Marquette is a little bit down from last year. Obviously, Purdue doesn't have Carson Edwards, and that's a huge hit. But I think that Purdue has the depth that Marquette lacks.
Well, and as we're recording here, of course, numbers popping over at BetOnline for Wednesday. We are recording this on Tuesday afternoon, because of some prior commitments that we both have. But, hey, what is your number on this game?
We have Purdue -1 on this one.
Okay, so effectively, it's a little more than a coin flip because you've got, obviously you have to factor in a little bit of home court advantage from Marquette. So, at least with the game being played in Milwaukee. So, you do think Purdue a better team on a neutral floor. And as you mentioned, I mean, the usage for Howard, something that you absolutely want to factor into the equation. One other college basketball game to touch on here as we fast forward all the way ahead to Saturday, Tennessee and Washington. And this isn't for us to kick around Rick Barnes, but this is an interesting game because Washington plays its opener against Baylor in Anchorage, Alaska, now plays Tennessee in Toronto, Ontario. Very unique spot here, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we'll have some chances to kick around Rick Barnes later in the year.
Oh, we will.
I can't laugh too much right now. I don't want everybody to hear my hacking cough, but I will say, I always look forward to those times to talk about Rick Barnes. But
it's like we bond over them.
Right, I know. It's I think us and our listeners. Yeah, I know. Listeners at this point really look for that kind of information. So we'll definitely get that to you later this year. But I agree with you. I think that this is a spot where it's really unique. Washington plays that zone that is so good. They extend out that zone. I'm very curious to see how they do rebounding the basketball this year. You've got the farther out 3-point line. Are they going to keep pushing it out farther and farther? What are they going to do? They're against this Tennessee team here who I think Tennessee, they lost a decent amount from last year. They still have good guards. I think Tennessee is a good team. They really crash the offensive boards. Rick Barnes is all about them trying to get second chance opportunities. They don't necessarily get back in transition as quick as some teams. If Washington gets the rebound, they're going to try to take off as fast as they can. Washington wants to play fast on offense. But then you've got, can Washington get the defensive rebound? This is a really interesting game. I would lean toward the under here with this neutral site. I don't think the shooting percentages will be too great. My concern with the under would be, how many offensive rebounds is Tennessee going to get? Because as you think about this, you say, Tennessee crashing the boards the way they are, you would imagine that Tennessee would get quite a few offensive boards in this one. And obviously, how's Tennessee going to do against that zone?
Yeah, I think those are a couple of really big questions here, to say the least. One interesting thing, Isaiah Stewart, maybe the top freshman for Washington here this year. He does have some guys that are pretty on par with him, but Isaiah Stewart from upstate New York. He actually went from Rochester to Washington, was getting looked at by Syracuse, winds up going with Mike Hopkins instead of Jim Boeheim. Almost a homecoming-esque type of game for him because Washington will not play a true road game until they play Stanford the first week. I think it's actually the second week of January in Pac-12 play. So this is the closest he'll play to home. I'm sure he'll be well represented there by friends and family and everything. So obviously he'll be a guy, fully mobilized to get up and go here. But that's the question, and that is Washington's weakness. It was a weakness last year. They did pretty well against Baylor in that department. How do they do against Tennessee could very well define who wins that game.
Yeah, and I want to say one other thing as I'm looking here at the numbers. Tennessee was really good against zone last year. According to Synergy, they were 99th percentile, so really excellent against zone defenses. Obviously, they have a little bit of different personnel, but if you look at their numbers from last year, you would assume that Tennessee would do very well against the zone. This would be a game where I wouldn't be anxious to go against Tennessee. Like I said, I'd probably lean toward the under if I had to take something because of the neutral site, but I think I might have to lean toward Rick Barnes' team, which seems kind of strange here to me.
I like it. We're going to do that early on in the year here. The question I have, Tennessee does play, or Mount St. Mary's plays Washington beforehand. That's on Tuesday night. Tonight, Tennessee plays Murray State tonight. Without taking those games into consideration here, about where do you have this Tennessee and Washington number?
Yeah, I think maybe -1.5 or so. I don't have that number ready right now, but I think -1.5, -2 for Tennessee. I'm not sure what the market will come at here. I think it depends on how those two games before go. Washington with a nice win on the neutral. Maybe pick them is closer. Pick to Tennessee -1, -1.5. I would look to play Tennessee if it's around pick 'em. Like I said, I'm not anxious to back a Rick Barnes coach team, so I don't know that this one will make my schedule. I do think, though, that this is a really interesting game that's going to tell us a lot about both teams. Can Washington rebound with the new rules? Tennessee is going to be a really good test for that. And Tennessee, how similar are they to last year's team? Are they still excellent at beating the zone, or something different this year?